So we're continuing with the discussion of natural selection, and we were just talking about the 4 different elements, and I had given an example of a feature that already existed spreading throughout a population because the organisms with the feature were more likely to survive and reproduce than the organisms without the feature, and so in the second generation there would be more organisms with the feature than without, like the antibiotic resistance, and that would just continue. But evolution can also produce novel features and then spread those throughout the population, and that's how we actually get an increase in complexity, which is what we're interested in for the purposes of this course. And so we need to see an example where that happens. And that happens because of the 4th element of natural selection, that there are mutations, that the offspring are not perfect copies of the parents, but rather can differ to some degree in a random way. So we're now going to see how that mutation element helps to explain how we can have increases in complexity. So what about when there's, but this last feature, or this last element, is really important, that there can be variation, that the offspring can be somewhat different than the parents. There can be mutations. So the development of the eye is an example of this, and I think I'd like you to watch the YouTube video of how eyes develop. They've evolved at least 5 different times separately, but the course of evolution of the eye goes like this. So you have an organism that's in water, and it has an eye spot. An eye spot is just a group of cells called photoreceptors that are light sensitive. So there's some light sensitive cells on the surface of the animal's or the organism's skin, and it turns out that the ones that have more clusters, that there's some variation in how clustered the photoreceptors are, how clustered the light sensitive cells are, and there's some variation from parent to child. So when a parent, or when one of these organisms has more of the light sensitive clusters, they're more likely to survive, it turns out. And over time, occasionally a child will have more photoreceptors than in clumps than its parent did, and that one's going to be even more likely to survive than all of its siblings. So as time passes, you get these clumped photoreceptors. At first there was just a little eye spot, and now there's more clumping, more photoreceptors getting pulled into making, basically, as I understand it, a bigger eye spot. It turns out that if the eye spot is cupped a little bit, then the animal or the organism can be a little more sensitive to where the light is coming from, which is what it is helpful for it at this point to survive. So when an organism, an offspring, mutates a little bit, and the skin gets a little bit more cupped, okay, that organism is going to be even more likely to survive, and so that cupped eye is then going to spread throughout the population. And then there are further changes, so then, there might be a little bit of a mutation where there starts to be a little bit of a cover over the eye cup, or the eye cup, and then organisms with that little bit of a cover are going to be more likely to reproduce. So we have these mutations where there are changes in the way in which the photoreceptor cells are distributed on the animal's skin, or the shape of the animal or of the organism's skin, or whether or not there's a covering. And each time there's a new feature that arises by mutation that is more likely to help the animal survive to the age of reproduction, that feature is then going to spread throughout the population. So we can think of it like this. Here we have all our organisms with photoreceptors, and the green ones have clustered photoreceptors. So they're going to be more likely to reproduce, so in the next generation there are going to be more green ones, which is to say more of these organisms with the clustered photoreceptors. And they keep spreading throughout the population because they do better than the organisms without the clustered photoreceptors. But then some of these organisms start to develop their mutations, and some of them have a cupped eye spot, so there's an indentation where the photoreceptors are. And these ones survive, even do better, and so there are more of them in the next generation. So now we're having there are more and more of them with photoreceptors at all, and some of them have mutated and to have the curved surface, and those ones are even more likely to survive. And they're even more likely to survive, and at this point now all of the organisms have the cupped eye. So you have, starts off with just photoreceptors, and then they get clustered together, and then there are divots in the surface of the skin, and each of these changes helps the animal or the organism to reproduce, and so there are more of its offspring and more offspring like it with those features in the next generation. There are going to be all sorts of other mutations, so maybe the photoreceptors spread out in some animals, or maybe in some animals the photoreceptors are on a bump instead of an indentation on the organism's skin. Those mutations, those features are less helpful for reproduction, and so organisms with those features reproduce less. So we just have this process where little changes accumulate over time, and we get a big change if there's enough time passes. And it's really a growth in sophistication. So, you might think of the eye, and there are all the different parts to the eye, right? There's the lens, and the cornea, and the iris, and the back of the eye, and it's really complicated. But the initial eye doesn't have like some parts and not others. It's just a much, much simpler structure. And then as the animal or the organism evolves, the parts start getting more, it starts getting to have different parts that have different jobs. So there's the eye cup part, and there's the covering part. And so that's called differentiation. So we have an increase in differences between parts. We're not necessarily adding the final parts one by one. There's another sort of thing that can happen, which isn't illustrated by the eye, called exaptation. And that's where an old feature gets used in a new way. So animal fin or fish fins turned into animal limbs, for example. Or baboons' teeth. Male baboons have big incisor teeth, and those teeth first evolved in the context of sexual reproduction. The male baboons with bigger teeth were more likely to have sex and have children than the male baboons with smaller teeth, but then those teeth helped the male baboons defend against predators. And then the baboons' teeth were then being used in a new way and helped the baboons survive even more. The baboons with bigger teeth survive even more, and so the bigger teeth spread. Another sort of random example are psychoactive drugs. So, marijuana has a bunch of chemicals in it. You smoke it or whatever, you get those chemicals into your system, they get into your brain, you get high, they have an effect, right? Or they're mushrooms, and if you eat the right kind of mushroom, you will hallucinate. If you eat the wrong kind of mushroom, the mushroom will poison you and you'll die. But if you eat the right kind, it will make you hallucinate. And that's actually like super weird if you think about it. Why is it that there are plants that if you get them into your body, parts of the plant components do things in your brain? Well, the general explanation is that there's a chemical that the plant produces that does something in the plant, and then at some point in our evolutionary history, that plant chemical got hijacked and turned into a signaling system in our brains. And so the chemical is initially used for whatever the plant uses it for, but because we have a common ancestor with the plant, our bodies are able to do things with this chemical as well, and end up using it as a signaling system in our brain. And then when we ingest the plant, if we do, then we load up our brain with this signaling system, and you get high. So it's a change in how this chemical is used. So how does complexity increase in this situation? Because that's in the end what we care about. We're talking about Paley, who thinks that you need a powerful intelligence to create good complexity, and what we have here is a picture where complexity can increase without a guiding designer. You have the initial organism, its offspring randomly change, and the randomly different offspring might be slightly more complex, and more complex in a way that makes them more fit. They might be more complex in a way that makes them less fit, but they might be more complex in a way that makes them more fit, and in that case, they're more likely to survive. and that feature is going to spread throughout the population, and then you have all of the organisms with that one feature, and then some of them will mutate and get a second feature, and a second feature that makes them more fit, and then you get feature 1 and 2 throughout the population, and then all the organisms with feature 1 and 2, then at some point, feature 3 arises as a result of random mutation, and it turns out to be make the animals more fit, and so then it spreads throughout the population. So what happens is these random changes spread throughout the population over generations, and they accumulate. So there's one small increase in complexity with the first change, but then it just happens over and over and over and over, and you get over time a lot of really big changes. So you get humans evolving from something like bacteria. So this process of natural selection is unguided and unintelligent. All that's happening is that organisms are surviving and reproducing at different rates. The ones that survive more have more offspring, and so there will be more children like them than there will be children like the ones that don't have as many offspring. And there's no goal. Maybe each organism has a goal to reproduce, like maybe lots of animals have a goal to reproduce, but not all organisms have goals. Bacteria don't have minds at all. They don't have goals. Plants don't have minds. They don't have goals. There's no intervention by any outside agent guiding the process. It's just some of them survive more, some of them survive less. Those features spread, and then mutation produces new features that then some of which spread because they help the animal to survive. And this can increase complexity if the mutations that are producing fitness enhancing features are making things more complex, like as in the case of the eye. This natural selection process does not have to increase complexity. Sometimes being simpler will be more effective, and that's why there are new bacteria that weren't around millions of years ago, because it turned out that those bacteria are descended from maybe things that were more complex, and they got simpler, because in their situation, being simpler helps to reproduce. So why should we believe the theory of evolution? Well, there's actually a lot of evidence for it. First of all, in particular, natural selection. We can see natural selection at work in organisms that reproduce very quickly. So, bacteria, for example, you can see them evolve in the lab. The fossil record shows evolution. The fossil record doesn't show natural selection, but it does show change over time, right? The fossils you find in different layers are different. Then if we look at all the animals or organisms that are alive today, we see lots of forms that are both common but also different in certain ways. So animals have a basic body plan that then we then see modified in certain ways. So there's a body plan that we share with apes and other primates. 4 limbs, head on top, torso and trunk in the middle. Not everything is like that, right? Plants aren't like that, for example. And then, dogs and cats and cows and deer are also similar. Body, trunk, head, 4 limbs. And then it turns out that, fish actually have a very similar shape. There's the head, the mouth, the body, and then limbs off the body. And, a digestive system that runs through it. That's sort of the gross form, but there are also lots of there are lots of biochemical mechanisms that are very similar, but have certain variations. So all the animals or all organisms use DNA. There are commonalities in DNA across all organisms. Almost all of our DNA is exactly the same, for example, as the DNA of chimpanzees. In different organisms, you have very similar cellular structures. In different organisms, so we have hormones, which are chemical signaling systems in our bodies. They are spread throughout the animal kingdom. They're used sometimes for different signaling, sometimes the same kind of signaling, but the use of these certain chemicals as signals is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. There are things called mitochondria that are part of the cell that are involved in making energy available to cells, and they're spread throughout. I said there's a body plan that's common to all animals, but that has variations because obviously different animals have somewhat different body plans. The genetics underlying that body plan is basically the same. If you go and look in the different animals, you can see, okay, the same genes are doing the same work. So we have all this commonality with variation, and we can see natural selection in action in a small scale. And then it turns out that the rate of change of species that we see in the fossil record, right, the species change over time, that rate of change is the same rate as we independently observe mutation rates in DNA, and they match. So there's just tremendous amounts of evidence for the theory of evolution. This is all stuff that the theory of evolution explains really well, and that otherwise we would have no explanation for. So theory of evolution, very well confirmed. And natural selection as a part of it. So what do you need to remember about this? What you need to do, remember, there are these four elements of natural selection. That we have a group of organisms from the same species competing to reproduce, that some of their features are better for survival than others, that these features are inherited by offspring, but they're not perfectly inherited, that the offspring are somewhat different with respect to the features that make a difference to survival. That's what mutation is. When we have these four conditions, you have evolution, you have change over time. So not only will features that are already in the population, the fitness-enhancing features will spread throughout the population, but because there are mutations, there'll be new fitness-enhancing features will spread throughout the population. And so over successive generations, the organism can change fairly dramatically. So natural selection is just one mechanism of evolution. Evolution can produce gradual increases in complexity, although it doesn't have to. It can. It doesn't have a goal or guiding intelligence. And so it's a way that complexity can increase without having a guiding intelligence, and that's why it's a problem for Paley's argument, because it shows that his second premise is not true, that you can have complexity created without a guiding intelligence. And the theory of evolution is one of the best supported scientific theories ever. It's a theory, and it's super well confirmed and almost certain to be true.